It all started with a drip. Alex noticed it on the third night in his new apartment. A monotonous, methodical sound that seemed to be counting the seconds of his slowly draining sanity. Drip. Pause. Drip. Lying in bed, the young man stared at the unfamiliar ceiling, where shadows from the streetlights danced like bony ghosts. He had moved to Oak Heaven 3 days ago, and escaped from the concrete jungle of New York to this quiet, sleepy New England town. A change of scenery, peace, and quiet seemed to be exactly what he needed to silence the noise in his own head and focus on his work. As a freelance graphic designer, Alex was fortunate enough to not be tied down by geography. The apartment was exactly what he could afford, spacious but in desperate need of renovation, located on the second floor of an old Victorian house called the Grand View. An ironic name for a building whose windows faced the brick wall of the neighboring house and a trash-strewn courtyard. High ceilings with cracked plaster molding, creaky oak floors that groaned with every step, and a pervasive smell of dust, old wood, and something else, subtly sweet, like wilted flowers. And, as it turned out, a faulty faucet in the bathroom. Drip. With a heavy sigh, Alex threw back the covers. The cold air immediately bit at his skin. He walked down the short, dark hallway and into the bathroom. The room seemed frozen in time. Yellow tiles with fine cracks like a spider's web, a cast-iron bathtub on massive lion's paw feet covered in chipped enamel, and a pedestal sink. The light from the single bulb above the cloudy mirror was dim and sickly yellow, turning his own reflection into a stranger with sunken eyes. Drops fell from the tip of the chrome faucet, and shattered against the drain with depressing regularity. He turned the handles with so much force that the metal screeched, but it didn't help. Drip. To hell with you, he muttered and was about to leave when he heard it. It wasn't the sound of dripping water. It was another sound, almost imperceptible, thin and high-pitched, lost somewhere on the edge of hearing. Alex froze, listening intently. The sound was gone. He must have imagined it. Old houses are a symphony of strange noises, the creaks of drying beams, the groans of old pipes, the howl of wind in the chimney. He was ready to blame it all on fatigue and his frayed nerves after the move. But then he heard it again. It was a cry. Very quiet, distant, as if coming from the other end of a long, damp tunnel. The cry of a baby. Alex frowned, feeling a chill run down his spine. He knew that an elderly woman, Mrs. Gable, lived in the apartment below him, and his neighbors on the side, through his bedroom wall, were a young couple who, judging by the loud music coming from their place in the evenings, were childless. Maybe the sound was coming from the street. The designer walked over to the tiny, fogged-up bathroom window that overlooked the courtyard and forced it open. Only the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of a lone car entered the night air. No crying. Closing the window, he was once again in silence, broken only by the persistent drip. He listened, holding his breath. Silence. He must have imagined it after all. He went back to bed, buried himself under the covers, and strangely enough, fell asleep rather quickly to the monotonous accompaniment of the dripping faucet. The next couple of days were a blur of activity, unpacking endless boxes, assembling furniture, setting up his workspace, and getting acquainted with the local grocery store. Alex had almost forgotten about the strange sound. Immersed in his work, he tried to catch up on what he missed during the move. He solved the faucet problem temporarily but effectively by placing a folded towel under it, which muffled the sound of the drips. On the 5th night, a nightmare woke him. He dreamed he was drowning in dark, viscous water, like oil. It filled his lungs, and he couldn't scream. And someone's small, cold hands were clinging to his ankles, pulling him down to the bottom, into the icy, silent darkness. Alex sat up in bed, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest like a trapped bird. The apartment was dead silent. The towel in the bathroom must have been soaked through, because he could clearly hear it again, drip, drip, drip. And the crying. This time it was louder. It no longer seemed like a figment of his imagination or a quirk of old plumbing. It was a distinct, desperate child's cry that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Alex got up and on stiff, cotton-like legs, walked to the bathroom. He flipped the switch. The yellow light snatched the cracked tiles and his own frightened face in the mirror from the darkness. He stood in the middle of the room, not breathing, and listened. The crying didn't stop. It was intermittent, with heart-wrenching sobs. And it was coming from. Alex slowly, as if afraid to startle the source of the sound, bent down toward the bathtub. His ear was level with the rust-stained drain. Yes. Without a doubt, the sound was coming from there. From the dark, damp-smelling throat of the pipe. "Hello?" he called out softly, his own voice sounding foreign and uncertain. Alex felt like a complete idiot. The crying stopped for a moment. A pang of hope was immediately replaced by a chilling terror. Because the silence was shattered by a piercing, heartbreaking scream. A scream of unbearable pain and animalistic fear. Alex recoiled from the tub as if he'd been electrocuted. His brain desperately clung to the remnants of logic. Acoustics. Ventilation. A child was crying somewhere in the building, and the sound was somehow resonating in the pipes in a bizarre way and coming out right here. It was the only rational, albeit far-fetched, explanation. He straightened up, trying to calm his wildly beating heart. Just an old house. Just strange acoustics. Tomorrow he would talk to the manager, Mr. Henderson. And he would definitely ask the neighbors if they had heard anything. The scream suddenly cut off, as if sliced by a knife. Now all that came from the drain was the gurgling of water and a quiet, barely audible rustling, like the scraping of tiny fingernails on rusty metal. Alex turned off the light and hurried out of the bathroom, closing the door tightly behind him. That night, he slept on the couch in the living room, as far away from that place as possible. But even through the closed door and with cotton in his ears, he thought he could hear the quiet, monotonous dripping of water and something else. Something that sounded like a muffled whisper, repeating his name over and over again. The morning brought with it a gray, joyless sky and a firm resolve to get to the bottom of things. Sleep-deprived and angry, Alex went down to the manager's office on the first floor. Mr. Henderson was a portly man in his 60s with a face that seemed permanently frozen in an expression of sour displeasure. He was sitting at a desk cluttered with papers, reading a newspaper. "Plumbing issues?" the manager grumbled without looking up from his reading as Alex explained his problem, intentionally omitting the strangest part. "Leaky faucet." "Got it. I'll write it down. The plumber will come, eventually. It's not just the faucet." Alex frowned. "There are strange sounds coming from the pipes. At night. Very loud." Henderson finally tore his eyes away from the newspaper and gave Alex a heavy look over his glasses. "Sounds? Son, this house is over 100 years old. Everything here creaks, groans, and sighs. The pipes are old. When someone flushes a toilet 3 floors up, it can sound like someone's dying in your bathroom. Get used to it. It doesn't sound like water," the new tenant insisted. "It sounds like crying." The manager froze for a moment. His displeased expression was replaced by something else, an impenetrable mask. "Crying, you say? Probably just cats in the yard. Or the wind. Don't fill your head with nonsense. And let people work." He pointedly buried his face back in the newspaper, making it clear that the conversation was over. Annoyed and humiliated, Alex left. He decided to try his luck with the neighbors. The door to the apartment across the hall was opened by a young guy with disheveled hair and sleep still in his eyes. It was Mark, one half of the musical couple. "Hey, neighbor," Alex said, trying to sound as friendly as possible. "Sorry to bother you. I just wanted to ask, have you heard anything strange at night? Any sounds from the bathroom?" Mark yawned. "Sounds? Nah. We're usually listening to music or watching movies. And we sleep like logs. Why, did something happen?" "No, nothing, just old pipes, I guess," Alex muttered, realizing he wouldn't get any help from them. That left Mrs. Gable from the apartment below him. He knocked on her door, which was adorned with a brass nameplate. The door opened a crack, the width of a security chain, and a wrinkled, watchful eye appeared in the gap. "Yes?" a creaky, elderly voice asked. Alex introduced himself and asked the same question. He saw the eye in the crack widen. A long pause followed. "Some sounds are best left unheard, young man," the woman finally said. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "This house, it remembers a lot. Not all of its memories are pleasant. If something calls to you from the darkness, don't answer." And before Alex could ask what she meant, the door slammed shut. The lock clicked. He spent the rest of the day trying to work, but his mind was elsewhere. The old woman's words echoed in his head. Alex felt like a character in a cheap horror movie. By evening, he was on edge. He couldn't take it anymore. He needed proof. Proof that he wasn't going insane. Night fell on Oak Heaven like a black shroud. Alex sat on the floor in the hallway across from the bathroom door, armed with his phone's voice recorder. He waited. An hour, then another. The house was silent. Even the faucet seemed to have stopped dripping. Maybe it was over? Maybe it was some one-time, inexplicable phenomenon? And then it began. First, a quiet, pitiful whimper. Then it grew into desperate sobs. Alex slowly stood up and, trying not to make a sound, entered the bathroom. The crying seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the small space. "What do you want?" the young man whispered into the darkness of the drain. The crying stopped. For a few seconds there was absolute silence. And then, from the pipe, came a clear, icy whisper that sounded so close it was as if someone had whispered directly into his ear. "Cold." Alex jumped back, dropping his phone. It hit the tiled floor with a crack. He couldn't take it anymore. This wasn't his imagination. This was real. And it was in his bathroom. The next day, ignoring the sideways glances of shoppers, he bought the cheapest endoscopic camera at the hardware store, a long, flexible wire with a tiny camera and light at the end that connected to a smartphone. He was going to look into that damn pipe. He had to know what was in there. Waiting until nightfall, Alex locked himself in the bathroom. His hands were shaking as he connected the camera to a new phone he had just bought. His heart was beating so loudly it drowned out all other sounds. Turning on the camera's light, he slowly, centimeter by centimeter, began to lower it into the drain. An image appeared on the phone's screen. The inner surface of the pipe was covered with a disgusting layer of rust and slimy black gunk. He pushed the camera deeper, past the bend of the P-trap. The water in the trap momentarily clouded the image, and then he was in the main, vertical pipe. The camera descended lower and lower, and Alex stared at the grainy image. 10 centimeters, 20, 30. Suddenly, something flashed in the dim light of the LED. Something pale, white against the black grime. He froze, trying to focus the image. It wasn't trash, not a clump of hair. It had a definite shape. Bringing the phone closer to his face, Alex peered at the screen. For a split second, before the screen flickered and went dark, giving way to hissing static, he saw it. 2 large, dark, wide-open eyes, staring directly into the lens. Alex screamed. It was a short, choked cry, swallowed by the bathroom walls. He threw the phone as if it had burned his hands. The device hit the wall and slid to the floor, the screen dark. The endoscope cable, still sticking out of the drain, seemed like a venomous snake slithering out of its lair. Stumbling, he backed away until his back hit the door, and he fumbled for the handle. He burst out of the bathroom, slamming the door with such force that a picture fell off the wall in the hallway. Pressing his whole body against the door, breathing heavily, he listened. Not a sound came from behind the door. No crying. No whispers. Nothing. Only a silence that now seemed even more sinister. Alex yanked the cable out of the drain. A sharp, animalistic pull. A spray of dirty water and something else, a long, black, human-like hair, flew out of the opening. He threw the cable away in disgust and rushed to the kitchen sink, frantically washing his hands, scrubbing them as if trying to scrape off his skin. He had seen those eyes. They were burned into his retinas. Empty, dark, full of an ancient sorrow and something else, something hungry. Sleep was impossible that night. Alex sat in the kitchen, drinking cold coffee and watching the gray, dreary dawn break outside the window. He could no longer deny what was happening. It wasn't acoustics, not his imagination, and not cats. There was something else in his apartment. Something that lived in the pipes, in the arteries and veins of this old, rotting house. And it knew he was there. From that moment on, everything changed. The activity was no longer confined to the bathroom. Whispers followed him around the apartment. Quiet, barely audible, they came from over his shoulder when he sat at his computer, from a dark corner of the bedroom when he tried to sleep. He could make out individual words: help, alone, play. Other things started happening too. Small, but unsettling. The kitchen faucet, which he distinctly remembered closing, would be slightly open, a thin stream of ice-cold water trickling from it. The bathroom door, which he now always kept tightly shut, he found ajar several times, a draft of dampness and the smell of algae seeping from the crack. One evening, while working on a project, Alex felt an icy touch on his cheek, as if someone had run a wet finger across it. He jumped up, but of course, there was no one in the room. He stopped using the bathroom. He washed in the kitchen, quickly and nervously, constantly looking over his shoulder. He now looked into the kitchen sink's drain with apprehension. He felt like he was being watched from the darkness. Desperation drove him to action. He couldn't stay here any longer, but he had nowhere to run. He had just spent his last savings on the move and the security deposit. Alex had to understand what he was up against. Mrs. Gable's words, "This house remembers a lot," were stuck in his head. He headed to the Oak Haven Public Library, an old red brick building in the center of town. In the archives, which smelled of dust and decaying paper, he spent several hours sifting through old newspaper binders. He was looking for anything related to his address, to the Grandview house. After flipping through yellowed pages from the 60s, 50s, and 40s, he was about to give up when he came across a small article in the Oak Haven Evening Herald from October 1938. A short article with a blurry photograph of a little boy in a sailor suit. The headline read, "Local boy missing." Alex's heart skipped a beat. He devoured the text. 7-year-old Timothy Bradley had disappeared from his apartment in the Grandview 3 days ago. He was last seen by his mother, playing in his room. Searches organized by the police and local residents yielded no results. No traces, no witnesses, no ransom demands. The boy had simply vanished. Alex scanned further. The address. Apartment 2B. His apartment. With trembling hands he turned the page, looking for a follow-up. There were a few more articles in subsequent issues. The police were stumped. They questioned neighbors, checked on all suspicious individuals in town. One detail caught his attention. Timothy's mother, a grief-stricken woman named Eleanor Bradley, told a reporter that her son had a strange habit. He liked to talk to the pipes. The boy would sit in the bathroom for hours, his ear pressed to the drain, whispering to the water friend, as he called it. Doctors dismissed it as childish fantasies. There was no more mention of Timothy Bradley in the newspapers. The case remained unsolved. Alex sat in the deafening silence of the archives, a coldness that had nothing to do with the room's temperature seeping into his bones. Timothy. Timmy. The boy who whispered to the pipes in his bathroom. The boy who was cold and alone. He returned to the apartment at dusk. Fear had been replaced by a strange, morbid clarity. He now knew who was crying in his bathroom. But this knowledge brought no relief. On the contrary, it made the horror tangible, personal. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the living room, listening to the sounds of the house. But this time, everything was different. The crying had stopped. The whispers had ceased. Not a sound came from the bathroom. At first, Alex felt relieved. Maybe his investigation had somehow soothed the boy's spirit? Maybe he just wanted to be remembered. But then, around 3 in the morning, he heard a new sound. It was quiet, barely audible, but it made his blood run cold faster than any scream. From behind the closed bathroom door came a soft, cheerful humming. A nonsensical children's tune, the kind a child hums to themselves while playing. And that sound was much, much scarier than the crying. Because the crying was a plea for help. And this was an invitation. Alex froze on the couch, transformed into a statue of flesh and blood. Every muscle in his body tense to the breaking point. The humming continued. Monotonous, just a few repeating notes, but in its simplicity lay madness. The melody seeped through the closed door, penetrating his ears, his brain, and sending shivers down his spine. It was the sound of absolute loneliness that had found itself an amusement. He sat like that for what felt like an eternity, paralyzed by a primal terror. The part of his brain responsible for survival was screaming, "Run! Get up and run, don't look back!" But his legs wouldn't obey. He was glued to the spot, hypnotized by that creepy, innocent tune. Finally, as the first gray rays of dawn began to peek through the blinds, the humming stopped. Just as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that replaced it was heavy and oppressive, filled with an unspoken threat. Alex realized he couldn't live like this anymore. He couldn't work, could barely eat. He was a prisoner in his own apartment. Knowing the ghost's name hadn't given him power. On the contrary, it had made him more vulnerable. Now it wasn't just a nameless entity, but Timothy. A little boy who wanted to play. And Alex instinctively felt that the rules of this game were deadly. Gathering the last of his courage, he approached the bathroom door. His hand trembled as he reached for the cold brass handle. He slowly turned it and pushed the door open. It was cold inside. Much colder than the rest of the apartment. The air was damp and stale, smelling of river sludge and rust. Otherwise, everything was in its place. The old bathtub, the sink, the dim mirror. Nothing out of the ordinary. Taking a step inside, his bare foot stepped on something small and hard. He jerked his foot back as if burned. On the dirty tiled floor, right by the bathtub drain, lay a small glass marble. An old one, with cloudy swirls of blue and white inside. It definitely didn't belong to Alex. He had never seen one like it in his life. He stared at the marble, and a new wave of terror washed over him. This was proof. Not just a sound, not just a feeling. A physical object, transported from nowhere into his world. A message. Slowly, on weak legs, he backed out of the bathroom and closed the door tightly behind him. The moment the lock clicked, he heard a soft, distinct knock. Thump. As if that same glass marble, thrown by an unseen hand, had hit the inside of the door. That was the last straw. He needed help. He needed Mrs. Gable. He ran down the stairs and pounded on her door, not caring about decency. He was on the verge of hysterics. "Mrs. Gable! Please open up. I need to talk to you. It's about apartment 2B. About Timothy Bradley." There was silence. He thought she was going to ignore him, but then he heard the scrape of the chain and the turn of the lock. The door slowly opened. Mrs. Gable stood on the threshold. She was wearing an old robe, her gray hair tied in a messy bun. But this time, there was no fear or irritation in her eyes. Only boundless exhaustion and a hint of pity. "I knew you would come," she said quietly and stepped aside, letting him in. "They all do. Sooner or later." Mrs. Gable's apartment was the complete opposite of his. Clean and cozy, it smelled of lavender and mothballs. The walls were covered with crucifixes and icons, and religious figurines stood on every horizontal surface. It was like a small, overcrowded fortress of faith. She sat him down in an armchair and poured a cup of hot tea into his trembling hands. "Tell me," she said, sitting across from him. And Alex told her. Everything, from the beginning, the drips, the crying, the whispers, the camera, the newspaper article, and finally, the humming and the glass marble. He spoke disjointedly, jumping from one thing to another, but the woman didn't interrupt. She just sat and listened, her wrinkled face growing darker and darker. When he finished, she was silent for a long time, staring into space. "You made a big mistake, boy," the old woman finally said, her voice barely audible. "You looked into the pipe. You answered him. You showed him you were listening. I had to know. I thought it was just a ghost. The spirit of a child who couldn't rest. Mrs. Gable shook her head. Timothy. Poor boy. He was just the first one I remember. He wasn't evil. Just a lonely child with a rich imagination. He found himself a friend. The water friend, as he called it. What is this water friend? Alex asked, feeling a coldness spread inside him. It's not a friend, she whispered, her eyes darkening with an old fear. It's something ancient. It lives in the water, in the darkness. In the veins of this city, in the old pipes. It has always been here. This house was built on an old creek bed. For it, that's like an open door. It listens. It waits. It can't enter our world on its own. It needs someone to call it. Someone weak, lonely, like a little boy. Alex stared at her, unable to utter a word. It promised Timothy games and friendship. It lured him in. And it took him. Not his body, but his soul, his voice. And now it uses him as bait. Like a fisherman uses a worm. It shows you a crying boy to evoke your pity. It whispers to ignite your curiosity. It plays with you to break your spirit. It feeds on your fear. What does it want from me? Alex forced out. Mrs. Gable looked him straight in the eyes, and there wasn't a shred of hope in her gaze. It wants the same thing it wanted from Timothy. It wants you to open the door wider for it. It wants to come in. It wants to play. Mrs. Gable's words hung in the stale air of her apartment, heavy and cold like tombstones. Alex sat numb, trying to grasp the full scale of the horror. It wasn't a ghost trapped in the house. The house was trapped with something that lived beneath it. But what do? I can't just leave. I have no money, nowhere to go. It won't let you go. The old woman answered quietly. Now that it has tasted your fear, you're like a beacon in the darkness to it. Running is not an option. It's connected to water, and water is everywhere. Wherever you go, sooner or later you'll turn on a faucet. And it will be waiting. The hope Alex had felt coming here evaporated, leaving only icy despair in its wake. So that's it, he whispered. I just have to sit and wait for it to play with me. Mrs. Gable looked at the numerous crucifixes on her walls. I've lived in this house for 50 years. I've seen people move into your apartment, and I've seen them move out. Or be carried out. No one ever stayed long. They either fled, broken and terrified, or they became quiet. Stopped going out. And then they were found. Always in the bathroom. She paused, letting the words sink in. The entity grows stronger when it's feared. It feeds on it. But it can be contained. You can lock the doors. You have to cut off its path to you. How? By demolishing all the plumbing in the apartment? Alex scoffed bitterly. Don't be a fool. The doors I'm talking about aren't made of wood or metal. You have to seal all the entrances. All the drains. In the bathroom, in the kitchen. Stuff them with rags, seal them with duct tape. Don't let the water flow. Not a single drop. Use bottled water to drink, to wash. Don't take showers. The drier your apartment is, the weaker its influence will be. She stood up and went to a chest of drawers, taking out a small, rough-spun cloth bag. And this. Salt. Ordinary salt. Sprinkle it on the thresholds. The bathroom threshold, the front door. The windowsills. It doesn't like it. It's an old protection, but it works. At least for a while. Alex took the bag. It felt heavy and cool to the touch. This all sounded like the ravings of a mad person, but he had no choice. He was clinging to any hope, no matter how faint. Thank you, he said, getting up. And one more thing. Mrs. Gable stopped him, her gaze becoming hard and piercing. Never, do you hear me, never talk to it. Don't answer the whispers. Don't give in to the crying. And most importantly, don't look at your reflection in water. Or in the bathroom mirror. Reflections are its windows. Don't let it look into your soul. Armed with this strange knowledge and a bag of salt, Alex returned to his apartment. It no longer seemed just old and neglected, but hostile. He felt an unseen gaze on him from every dark corner, from every drain. He immediately got to work. With the fury of desperation, he plugged the drains with old towels and t-shirts, sealing them with several layers of duct tape. He drained the toilet, bailing out all the water, and taped the lid shut as well. Then he sprinkled salt along the thresholds and windowsills, creating fragile white barriers against an invisible enemy. He threw a sheet over the bathroom mirror. When he was done, he sat in the middle of the living room, breathing heavily. An unnatural silence fell over the apartment, unbroken even by the sound of dripping water. The first few hours passed peacefully. Alex even began to hope that it had worked. He tried to distract himself with work, but he couldn't concentrate. He was constantly listening for the slightest noise. When night fell, the retaliation began. First, he heard a scratching sound. It was coming from the bathroom. The scrape of fingernails on the inside of the door. SCRR. SCRR. Then it was joined by a quiet, pitiful cry, distorted, as if coming from underwater. It was Timothy's voice. Alex, let me in. It's so dark in here. I want to go home. Alex clamped his hands over his ears, repeating Mrs. Gable's words to himself. Don't answer. Don't listen. The crying turned into an angry hissing, and then a disgusting smell spread through the apartment. The smell of stagnant pond water, rotting algae, and wet earth. It came from everywhere, seeping into the air, the furniture, his clothes. It became hard to breathe. Alex jumped up when he saw it. Dark, damp stains were spreading across the wallpaper in the hallway leading to the bathroom. They grew right before his eyes, as if the walls were bleeding swamp sludge. A thin stream of dirty water trickled from the electrical outlet near the floor, leaving a winding trail on the parquet. He backed away into the living room in horror. And then the light bulb above his head flickered and went out with a soft pop. In the ensuing darkness, he heard a new sound. Drip, drip, drip. The sound wasn't coming from the bathroom. It was coming from the kitchen. Trembling, Alex turned on his phone's flashlight and aimed the beam towards the kitchen. The faucet, which he had tightly shut, was on full blast. But it wasn't water flowing from it. A thick, black, oily liquid, like tar, was pouring into the sink, already overflowing and spilling onto the floor. And in the center of this black puddle, slowly spinning, floated a small glass marble with blue and white swirls. Suddenly, in the complete silence, the sound of an incoming video call came from the laptop on the table. Alex froze, his heart plummeting. He wasn't calling anyone. He slowly aimed the flashlight beam at the laptop screen. There was an incoming call window. But instead of the caller's name, there was just one word. Timothy. And in place of the avatar was a black, empty field. And before he could do anything, the laptop automatically answered the call. An image appeared on the screen. It was a feed from his own webcam. He saw himself, frozen in horror in the dark room, lit only by the beam of his flashlight. But in the picture he wasn't alone. Over his shoulder, barely visible in the darkness, stood a small figure. Wet, with dark hair plastered to its forehead. The figure slowly raised its head. In the flashlight's beam, two large, dark, empty eyes gleamed. And then from the laptop's speakers, right behind him, came an icy, gurgling whisper. Found you. Instinct worked faster than thought. A primal, animalistic scream tore from Alex's chest as he threw the laptop aside and spun around, shining the flashlight into the emptiness behind him. No one. The room was empty. But the icy cold that lingered in the spot where he had seen the figure on the screen was undeniable. It burned his skin. The laptop hit the floor with a crack. Laughter emanated from the speakers, high-pitched, childish, but distorted, as if recorded on old film and played underwater. The laughter seemed to come from everywhere at once. Squish, squish, squish. The wet slapping of bare feet on the wooden floor. The sound came from the dark hallway leading to the bedroom. Alex aimed the trembling beam of his flashlight there. Empty. But on the floor glistened small, wet footprints, leading from nowhere and disappearing into the darkness. "Who are you?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "What do you want?" In response, from the darkness of the hallway came the same gurgling whisper, now filled with amusement. "Let's play hide-and-seek." "You're it." Alex couldn't take it anymore. The defenses had failed. The creature was inside. Not in the pipes. In his apartment. In his space. His only thought was to run. He rushed to the front door, slipping on the black sludge spreading from the kitchen. His hands fumbled frantically at the door, searching for the lock. He turned the latch, pulled the handle. The door wouldn't budge. He pulled again, with all his strength, throwing his body against it. Useless. It was locked as if it had been welded shut. A deafening crash came from the bathroom, as if someone had struck the cast-iron tub with a sledgehammer. Then another. And another. The bathroom door, which he had locked, began to shake violently in its frame. Cracks started to appear in the wood. In desperation, Alex turned, looking for another way out. The window in the living room. It led to the fire escape. It was his only chance. He rushed to the window, tore open the curtains. Beyond the glass was only impenetrable night darkness and the brick wall of the neighboring building. He grabbed the frame to lift it, and froze. On the glass, on the outside, were the prints of small hands. Dozens of prints left by dirty, swampy water. And as he watched, a message began to slowly form on the glass, right at his eye level, traced by an invisible finger. The letters were made of condensation. No escape. There was a crack. The bathroom door couldn't hold. It flew off its hinges and crashed into the hallway. In the doorway stood darkness. Not just the absence of light, but a thick, tangible darkness from which seeped cold and the smell of rot. And in this darkness, two faint lights began to form. Eyes. At that moment, something in Alex's mind snapped. Fear gave way to an icy rage. He was cornered. He was not going to die in this damned apartment. Grabbing a heavy metal tripod from the floor, the only thing at hand, he screamed, pouring all his terror and all his hatred into that cry. "Get out of my house!" He charged forward, into the darkness of the hallway, swinging the tripod. He struck at the spot where he had seen the eyes. The tripod met empty air, but Alex felt something icy and wet brush past his face. He heard a disappointed, angry sigh. And then the front door behind him clicked open on its own. Without a second's hesitation, Alex spun around and flew out into the stairwell, slamming the door behind him. Without stopping, he tumbled down the stairs and pounded on Mrs. Gable's door. "Open up! I'm begging you, open up!" The door flew open almost instantly, as if she had been waiting behind it. The old woman pulled him inside and slammed the door, immediately throwing the chain and turning all the locks. Alex collapsed onto the floor, breathing heavily, unable to utter a word. His clothes were stained with the black sludge, his hands shaking. Mrs. Gable stood over him, her face like a parchment mask. "It's out," she whispered. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. "You made it angry. This is bad. Very bad." She helped him up and sat him in a chair. Her small apartment, filled with icons, seemed like the last bastion of sanity in this madhouse. "The previous tenant, Mr. Ackerman," she began in a hollow voice, pouring him a small glass of brandy. "He also tried to fight. He tried to have the apartment blessed. He brought in a priest. But nothing helped. It only got worse. It started playing with him. Hiding his things, turning on the water in the middle of the night. And then it started showing him his late wife. Her voice from the pipes, her face in the reflections." Alex listened, his blood running cold. "One night I heard a scream from his apartment. And then, the sound of running water. The water ran for a long time. I called the police. They broke down the door. He was in the bathroom. He had filled the tub to the brim. And he was just lying there, under the water, with his eyes wide open. And he was smiling." The old woman crossed herself. "It didn't kill him, boy. It made him do it himself. It broke him. It convinced him that the only way to be with his wife again was to go into the water, to open the door all the way. She fell silent, and in the ensuing quiet, Alex heard a sound. Drip. He looked up. A small, dark spot had appeared on the ceiling in the center of Mrs. Gable's room. And from that spot, a single drop fell and landed on the wooden floor. Drip. The spot slowly grew larger. Drip. It was the same black, oily liquid. It was seeping through the ceiling. Directly from his bathroom. The crucifixes on the walls began to tremble slightly. Mrs. Gable looked at the ceiling, then at Alex. There was no longer simple fear in her eyes. There was a grim determination. My protections won't hold it anymore. It has broken through. It has marked you, and now it will come for you, wherever you go. We have only one option left. We can't defend anymore. We have to go to it. To its very heart. What do you mean? Alex rasped. The basement, she said, her voice becoming as hard as steel. Where this house touches the earth. Where the old creek disappears into the darkness. We have to cut off the source. Not in your apartment, but at the very foundation. The determination in Mrs. Gable's voice was unwavering, but Alex only felt the last of his own courage evaporating, giving way to a primal terror. The basement. The beast's lair. The idea of going down there voluntarily seemed like suicide. We can't, he began, but she cut him off. We must. She went to her chest of drawers, her movements quick and precise, showing no signs of elderly frailty. To sit here and wait is to let it take us one by one. It has already broken through my defenses. This apartment is no longer safe. The woman began to gather items, laying them out on the table. 2 powerful flashlights that seemed to weigh several pounds each. A large coil of twine. A heavy iron crowbar. And something that made Alex's blood run even colder, an old, worn revolver that she retrieved from a locked drawer. My husband was a policeman, she explained briefly, noticing his glance. I don't know if bullets will help, but I feel safer this way. She also took the largest crucifix from the wall and the bag of salt. You'll carry this, she said, handing Alex the crowbar and one of the flashlights. Follow me. And whatever you hear, whatever you see, don't stop and don't look back. She went to the door, took a deep breath as if diving into icy water, and unlocked the locks. When the door opened, they were enveloped in cold. The stairwell had changed. The dim light of the single bulb barely penetrated a thick, swirling fog that smelled of damp earth. The walls were covered in moisture, and water dripped from the ceiling, forming dark puddles on the floor. The sound of dripping was now everywhere, merging into a single, monotonous, hypnotic rhythm. They left the apartment. The door to Alex's apartment upstairs was ajar, an impenetrable darkness seeping from the crack. Mrs. Gable didn't look up. Her gaze was fixed downward, on the heavy metal door under the stairs that led to the basement. The door, always secured with a padlock, was now slightly ajar. A grave-like cold emanated from the opening. It's waiting for us, Mrs. Gable whispered. She pushed the door, and it swung open with a deafening screech, revealing a path into darkness. Damp stone steps led down into the impenetrable gloom. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of mold, rotting wood, and something else, metallic and sweet, like old blood. Alex turned on his flashlight. Its beams snatched from the darkness endless rows of rusty pipes covered in cobwebs, snaking along the walls and ceiling. They began their descent. Mrs. Gable went first, clutching a flashlight in one hand and the revolver in the other. Alex followed, his heart pounding against his ribs like a hammer. Each of their steps echoed loudly in the oppressive silence. The basement was huge, like a labyrinth. It was a tangle of small rooms filled with the junk of previous generations of tenants, old furniture under dusty sheets, resembling gravestones, broken children's toys, mountains of yellowed newspapers. The flashlight beam would pick out a glass-eyed doll, a rusty tricycle, a lone child's shoe from the darkness. Every object seemed sinister, filled with its own sad story. And then the voices began. At first, it was a quiet whisper, coming from all sides. It coiled around them like smoke. Alex couldn't make out the words, but the intonations were full of mockery and malice. Then the whispers began to take shape. "Alex, why did you abandon us, son?" He froze. It was his mother's voice. She had died of cancer 5 years ago. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the darkness. No one. "Don't listen," Mrs. Gable commanded, not turning around. "It's a lie. Keep moving." He forced himself to move, but now the voices grew louder, more insistent. He heard his father scolding him for bad grades, his first girlfriend accusing him of cheating. Every failure, every shameful act, every fear buried deep in his soul now echoed from the darkness, trying to breach his resolve. Mrs. Gable seemed to hear something too. Her face tensed, she gripped the revolver tighter. They went deeper, guided by the intensifying cold and a sound that now stood out clearly against the dripping, the sound of running water. It led them to the far wall of the basement, to an old brickwork section that was different from the rest of the foundation. Right here, at the base of the wall, was a puddle. A puddle of the same black, oily liquid that had flowed from Alex's faucet. It slowly seeped from a crack in the wall, forming a small, utterly black pool that didn't reflect the light from their flashlights. It absorbed it. "This is it," Mrs. Gable whispered. "The source. The old creek bed." She aimed her flashlight beam at the crack. The bricks around it were covered in slimy black mold, and an icy draft emanated from the crack itself along with the water. Alex moved closer, mesmerized by the place. He felt as if he were standing on the edge of an abyss leading to another, ancient, and hostile world. And then the black puddle at their feet began to move. The surface of the liquid rippled, as if something were rising from the depths. The sludge began to slowly gather in the center, taking shape. At first, it was just a formless mound, but it grew, stretched, forming limbs, a torso, a head. A few seconds later, a figure stood before them, knee-deep in the black water. The figure of a small boy in a soaked sailor suit. Timothy Bradley. He stood motionless, his head bowed, black sludge dripping from his hair and clothes. A dead silence fell over the basement. "Timothy?" Alex whispered with a trembling voice, taking a step forward. Mrs. Gable grabbed his arm. "That's not him," she hissed. The boy slowly raised his head. His face was pale, like that of a drowned person, but the most terrifying thing was his eyes. They were the same eyes Alex had seen in the pipe. 2 black, empty voids, with nothing human in them. The figure opened its mouth, and black liquid poured out. But the sound that echoed in the deafening silence of the basement was not a child's cry or a whisper. It was a low, guttural, gurgling roar, full of ancient malice and inhuman hunger. The boy's distorted face twisted into a gruesome smile, and he uttered one word in a voice that seemed to shake the very stones of the foundation. "Gotcha." The moment that word was spoken, everything around them exploded into chaos. The black puddle at their feet boiled, and dozens of viscous tentacles shot out from it. They lashed at the floor and walls, shattering old crates and knocking junk off shelves. The air filled with a deafening roar, a mix of the voices of hundreds of victims, their death screams and pleas. "Shoot!" Alex yelled, jumping back. The gunshot was deafening. Mrs. Gable, standing firm, fired directly into the center of the boy's figure. The bullet passed through it without causing any harm and ricocheted off the brick wall with a ping. The figure didn't even flinch. Its gruesome smile only widened. The illusion began to melt away. Timothy's childish body started to distort, stretching like melted wax. His arms elongated, turning into thin, branch-like appendages. His torso swelled, losing its human shape and becoming a formless mass of swirling darkness, from which pale, pain-twisted faces would emerge and then disappear. It wasn't one creature. It was a legion. A collective horror wearing the mask of a child. "To the wall!" Mrs. Gable shouted, realizing the futility of the weapon. "The crowbar! Seal the crack!" She threw the bag of salt onto the floor between them and the creature. The salt flared with a bright white light, and the tentacles that were reaching for them recoiled with a hiss, as if from fire. It bought them a few seconds. Alex, snapping out of his stupor, rushed to the wall, gripping the crowbar tightly. He jammed the flat end into the crack between the bricks and leaned into it with all his weight. The old cement gave way, crumbling. The creature roared with rage. The salt barrier couldn't hold it for long. It began to change shape, growing taller, more massive, pressing against the low basement ceiling. The voices in Alex's head intensified, turning into an unbearable scream. He saw his mother, standing in the middle of the black puddle. She was reaching out to him, her face contorted with grief. "Son, come to me. It's so cold and lonely here. Come to Mommy." Tears blurred his vision, his hands weakened. He almost believed it. He was ready to drop the crowbar and take a step toward her. "Alex! That's not her!" Mrs. Gable's voice cut through the mental storm. She was standing beside him, holding the crucifix forward. The silver metal glowed dimly in the darkness, and the creature seemed unable to get closer. It writhed as if in pain. "It's showing you what you want to see. Fight!" Her words brought him to his senses. He pushed on the crowbar with renewed strength. One brick gave way and fell to the floor with a thud. A stream of icy air and even thicker darkness gushed from the opening. Mrs. Gable cried out. One of the tentacles, bypassing the protective barrier from the side, wrapped around her ankle and pulled sharply. She fell, dropping the crucifix. The silver cross clattered away, and its light went out. Now nothing was holding the monster back. It descended on her. Several tentacles seized the woman, lifting her into the air like a rag doll. She screamed, but her scream was cut short as the black mass began to engulf her. "No!" Alex shouted. At that moment, his fear completely vanished, replaced by a blind, all-consuming rage. He no longer heard the voices. He saw no illusions. He saw only the monster killing the one person who had tried to help him. With an animalistic snarl, he tore out another brick. And another. He worked the crowbar like a man possessed, not feeling the pain in his bloody, scraped hands. The brickwork began to crumble. The creature, still consuming Mrs. Gable, turned its main mass toward him, in which a single, huge, gaping, eyeless void could now be seen, a mouth. It let out a piercing, deafening shriek and lunged at him, tossing the old woman's lifeless body aside. Alex had only a split second. He saw the wall of living darkness rushing toward him, felt its grave-like cold. He had no time to pull the crowbar out. He did the only thing he could. Leaning his entire body against the crowbar, he used it as a lever and, with a desperate cry, brought down the upper part of the brickwork. Stones and cement rained down with a crash, sealing the crack. The instant the last brick fell into place, cutting off the source, the creature, which had almost reached Alex, froze. Its piercing shriek reached a crescendo, and then its form began to disintegrate. It convulsed, bursting into thousands of black splatters. The tentacles vanished, the voices in his head fell silent. In a matter of seconds, the entire black mass simply disappeared, absorbed into the ground, leaving behind only a disgusting stench and an absolute, dead silence. Alex was on his knees, breathing heavily, stunned and empty. He looked at the pile of rubble, then at the still body of Mrs. Gable lying a few feet away. He had won. He had closed the door. But when he staggered to his feet and shone the flashlight on his hands, he saw that they were covered up to the elbows in the same viscous, black sludge that had seeped from the crack. It hadn't disappeared. It hadn't been absorbed into the ground. It had been absorbed into him. He heard a quiet sound. Drip. It wasn't coming from the pipes. Not from the walls. The sound was coming from inside his own chest. Alex slowly raised the flashlight to his face and looked at his reflection in the dark, damp stone of the wall. From the eyes of his reflection, two black, empty, bottomless voids stared back at him. And its lips slowly stretched into a familiar, gruesome smile. The voice that spoke in his head was Timothy's. But now he knew whose voice it really was. And it was his own. Now we play. 1 year later. For Maya, it all started not with a drip, but with a melody. She moved into the Grandview in the early fall, when the Oak Heaven air was thick with the smell of decaying leaves and smoke. Apartment 2B was a real find, an incredibly low rent for a huge space with high ceilings and large windows. Of course, the place was old, the floors creaked with every step, and the paint on the walls was cracked, forming bizarre patterns like maps of unknown lands. But Maya, being a children's book illustrator, saw not decay, but character in it all. The previous tenant left suddenly. Mr. Henderson grumbled, handing her the keys. His face wore the same sour expression of displeasure, as if her very existence was an inconvenience to him. Just disappeared. Left a bunch of stuff behind. We threw it all out. I hope you're more responsible. Maya assured him she was and enthusiastically began setting up her new nest. The apartment was strange. There was a chill in it that never left, even on the warmest days. Especially in the bathroom. But she attributed it to the old construction and poor insulation. The melody came on the fourth night. It was barely audible, thin and sad, like a lullaby sung in a whisper. Maya woke up and sat up in bed, listening. The sound seemed to come from the walls, from the very structure of the house. It was melancholic and almost beautiful. She decided it was one of the neighbors listening to music and went back to sleep. But the melody returned every night. Always the same one. And it always seemed to get a little louder, a little closer. Then other strange things began to happen. Small puddles of clean, cold water would appear in the most unexpected places, on the windowsill in the bedroom, on a stack of books in the living room, in the middle of the kitchen floor. No leaks from the ceiling, no traces. Just water, as if it had seeped out of the very air. One day, while unpacking the last box of books, Maya dropped a heavy art history volume. It hit the floor with a dull thud, and one of the floorboards near the wall lifted slightly. Burning with curiosity, she pried it up with her fingernails and peeked into the dark space beneath. There, in the dust and cobwebs, lay a small sketchbook with a black cover. She took it out. The sketchbook was damp to the touch. The pages, blurred by moisture, were filled with sketches. Faces twisted in horror. Dark, winding corridors. And again, a drawing of two large, empty eyes. On the last page, a single word was scrawled. Timothy. That night, the melody turned into words. It was no longer just a tune. It was a quiet, desperate whisper, coming from the drain in the bathroom. Help me! Maya froze in the bathroom doorway. It wasn't a child's voice. It was the voice of a young man, so full of pain and longing that her heart ached. Trapped, in the dark, so cold. She slowly approached the bathtub, feeling goosebumps on her skin. This was insane. She should have been scared, should have run, but there was something in the voice that evoked not fear, but sympathy. Who are you? She whispered, leaning over the drain. The whisper stopped for a moment. And then it came again, this time right next to her ear, although there was no one in the room. I'm the one who was here before you. My name is Alex. Over the next few days, the whisper became her constant companion. It told her a story. A story of a crying boy, of an ancient evil in the pipes, of a woman who tried to help. It told of a battle in the basement, and how he had closed the door, but paid a terrible price. It's not gone. Alex's voice whispered from the faucet as she brushed her teeth. It's inside me. It's using me, just like it used that boy. But I'm fighting. I'm not letting it out. But I'm getting weaker. I need your help. Maya didn't know what to think. She was on the edge. Was this real, or was she slowly going mad in this old, cold house? She told almost no one, afraid of being considered crazy. She stopped sleeping, constantly listening for the voice in the pipes. One evening, exhausted and desperate, she decided she needed to relax. She filled the old cast-iron tub with hot water, added bubble bath, and lit candles, trying to create an island of peace in this house saturated with fear. She sank into the warm water, closing her eyes. The melody she had first heard began to play softly from the drain. But now it didn't seem sad. It seemed soothing. You can free me, Alex's voice whispered, soft and persuasive. The source is weak again. The rubble in the basement, it won't last forever. If you go down, if you just move one stone, the pressure will be released. It will leave me. I can be free. We can both be free. Maya opened her eyes. The water in the tub had turned cold. Very cold. She looked at her reflection on the dark surface of the water. For a split second, it seemed to her that she was looking at a face that wasn't her own. It was the face of a young man with tormented, pleading eyes. Alex's eyes. She reached out her hand to touch the reflection. In that instant, a hand shot out of the drain. Not of flesh and blood, but woven from black, viscous water. It clamped onto Maya's wrist with a death grip. The reflection in the water changed. Alex's face twisted into a gruesome, triumphant smirk, and his eyes turned into two black, bottomless voids. The voice that now thundered in her head was not a plea for help. It was a low, ancient, hungry roar. You fool! Panic hit Maya like a physical blow. The icy grip on her wrist was unbearably strong, like a vice made of cold, wet stone. She screamed, instinctively trying to pull away, but the hand woven from darkness only tightened its hold. The water in the tub instantly turned from clear to inky black. It became heavy, thick like oil, and emitted a nauseating smell of rotting leaves and river sludge. Maya felt something slippery wrap around her legs, pulling her down into the viscous darkness. She screamed again, wildly, desperately, but the sound was swallowed by the small bathroom space. She knew that her neighbors, Mark and his girlfriend, had probably turned their music up to full blast again. No one would come. No one would hear. Scream, little artist! The voice thundered in her head. It no longer sounded like Alex's voice or Timothy's cry. It was a chorus. Thousands of whispering, growling, groaning voices merged into one. Your fear is so sweet. So fresh. Not like his. He's almost worn out. Images, alien and terrifying, flashed before her mind's eye. She saw the battle in the basement through Alex's eyes. She saw the darkness pour into him, his own personality drowning in an icy torrent of another's will. She saw a tiny glimmer of the real Alex, a small, trembling spark of light, buried under layers of gloom, screaming silently, begging her to run. The bathroom began to change. The cracked tiles on the walls darkened, covered in a slimy black mold that spread, forming patterns that resembled screaming faces. The single light bulb above the mirror flickered and died, plunging everything into darkness, broken only by the dim light of the candles. And the reflection in the mirror, from which Alex's sheet had long since fallen, was no longer hers. A tall, formless shadow stood there with two empty eye sockets from which black sludge oozed. Maya fought back. She braced her free hand against the edge of the cast-iron tub, straining every muscle to keep from being pulled under the water. The black hand jerked with inhuman strength, and her fingers slipped from the wet cast iron. You saw his drawings, the chorus mocked in her head. He tried to warn you, tried to banish us onto paper. But we are not a drawing. We are reality. And now you will draw something new for us. A kaleidoscope of nightmares, woven from her own fears, exploded in her consciousness. The characters from her children's books, cute and kind forest creatures, turned into monsters with needle-sharp teeth and empty, black eyes. They tore each other apart on the pages of her imagination. Sketches for her future works, full of light and joy, were flooded with ink, turning into scenes of torture and despair. The creature was rummaging through her soul, through her talent, and defiling everything she loved. She almost gave up. Her strength was failing. The cold seeped into her bones. The black water had already reached her chin. She made one last, desperate attempt. Gathering her remaining strength, she kicked the chrome faucet where it all began. There was a loud crack. The old, rusted pipe couldn't take it. The faucet broke away from the wall, and from the hole gushed not black sludge, but ordinary, clean water under immense pressure. The icy jet struck the center of the black mass in the tub. The creature howled. It was a shriek of pain and rage. The grip on Maya's wrist loosened. She used that moment, pushed off the bottom of the tub with her feet, and tumbled onto the tiled floor, coughing and spitting out black water. Without looking back, she crawled then on all fours out of the bathroom, which had now turned into a churning cauldron of black sludge and clean water, filled with an inhuman wail. She crawled down the hallway, leaving a wet trail behind her, reached the front door, turned the lock with trembling hands, and collapsed into the stairwell. She was free. Lying on the cold floor of the landing, shivering from the cold and the horror she had endured, she heard the wail in her apartment die down. Not a sound came from behind the door anymore. Even the water had stopped running. Slowly, with difficulty, she got to her feet. She had to run, to get as far away from this cursed place as possible. But something stopped her. The silence. It was unnatural. Absolute. Even the sounds from the street no longer penetrated here. Maya looked at her hand. Where the creature had held her, the skin was deathly pale, and dark, inky rivulets seemed to flow through her veins instead of blood. And then she heard it. Drip. The sound was quiet, almost gentle. It was coming from above. Maya slowly raised her head. On the ceiling above her, directly over the center of the stairwell, a small, dark spot had formed. And from it, a single black drop fell. It landed right on her forehead. Cold. Viscous. The door to apartment 2B creaked open behind her. A young man stepped out of the darkness into the stairwell. Alex. His clothes were dry, and his eyes were no longer empty. They were filled with an infinite, all-consuming sadness. "I'm sorry," he whispered in his real voice. "I tried to hold it back. But now it knows the way out." The spot on the ceiling above Maya began to grow, spreading in all directions. The black drops fell more and more frequently, turning into trickles, into a waterfall. The darkness, once trapped in one apartment, was now pouring out to consume the entire house. The cycle was not broken. It was expanded. "Run," Alex said again, his voice on the verge of breaking. His figure began to flicker, like a bad TV signal, his features momentarily twisting into a malevolent grimace before returning to an expression of despair. "It can't contain itself within me anymore. It's using the house. You have to run." But Maya couldn't move. The drop on her forehead was icy, and that coldness was spreading throughout her body, seeping under her skin, into her bones, into her thoughts. She was seeing something no one else could. She was seeing the grand view, for what it truly was. It was no longer a house. It was a living, breathing creature. The rusty pipes running through the walls were its veins, now pulsing with thick, black blood. The old live wires were its nerves, transmitting signals of pain and hunger. And every sink, every toilet, every drain in every apartment was one of its mouths, thirsting for new food, fear, despair, life. The drop on her forehead was a bite, a mark, an inoculation. She had become part of this organism. From the third floor above, a piercing female scream rang out, quickly choked by a gurgling sound. Then, a crash and a man's horrified cry. Water, tinged with an iridescent sheen like gasoline, began to seep from under the door of Mark and his girlfriend's apartment, and their loud music distorted, slowing into a funereal cacophony, interspersed with static and whispers. The entire house groaned. The hallway walls seemed to contract and expand, like lungs. The old floral wallpaper began to peel away, revealing damp, pulsating black plaster underneath. The light bulbs in the stairwell flickered and then exploded one by one, showering the floor in a rain of glass. The darkness was thickening. "It won't let me go," Maya whispered, looking at her hands, where the inky veins were becoming more prominent. "I'm a part of it now." "No!" Alex's voice sounded in her mind, desperate and strong. It was no longer speech, but a torrent of images and feelings. He was showing her his struggle from the inside, showing her how he clung to the remnants of his humanity, creating a tiny island of light in a boundless ocean of darkness. "You are its poison. You are different. You are a creator. It wants to use your imagination, but it also fears it. It can't just absorb you like the others. It has to break you. As long as you're not broken, we have a chance. A chance for what? She shouted into the darkness. Instead of an answer, an image flared in her mind. The basement. The old, rumbling boiler in the corner of the boiler room. The rusty valve of the gas pipe. And fire. An all-consuming, cleansing fire. Water gave it life. Alex's voice whispered. Only fire can take it away. This house, it's its body. It must be burned. To the ground. A suicide mission. Madness. But as she watched the darkness consume the stairwell, as pale, distorted faces began to emerge from the walls, Maya knew there was no other way. Die fighting, or become another whispering voice in the chorus of the damned. She made her choice. Lead the way, she said, her own voice sounding firm and unfamiliar. She plunged down the stairs, into the very heart of the nightmare. The house immediately reacted to her defiance. The steps beneath her feet turned into a slippery, viscous mass, trying to trap her ankles. Jets of icy water shot from the walls, knocking her off her feet. The air filled with voices, her voices. Her mother's voice, disappointed with her choice of profession. Her father's voice, telling her she would never achieve anything. Her ex-boyfriend's voice, laughing at her work. She screamed, clamping her hands over her ears, but then she felt Alex's mental touch, warm and encouraging. It's an illusion. It's using your memories. Don't believe it. She opened her eyes. The staircase was just a staircase again, though covered in slime. She got up and ran on. The basement door was wide open. A cold so intense it took her breath away emanated from the darkness. She turned on her phone's flashlight. The beam snatched a monstrous scene from the gloom. The basement had changed. It was no longer a labyrinth of rooms. It had become a single, organic space. The pipes on the walls pulsed like veins. The floor was covered with a thick layer of black sludge, in which floated debris and someone's forgotten belongings. And in the center, where the sealed crack used to be, now stood it. It was something indescribable, a creation of a diseased imagination. A tangle of rusty pipes, rotten wood, scraps of wallpaper, and wet plaster, all held together by a pulsating black matter. In the center of this grotesque construction, like a fly in amber, was the body of Alex. He was pale, his eyes were closed, but his chest rose and fell slowly in time with the hum that filled the basement. The creature was using him as a heart, as the central processor of its new body. Around him, in the black water, stood the others, ghostly, translucent figures of Timothy, Mrs. Gable, a gray-haired man who must have been Mr. Ackerman, and dozens of others whose faces were masks of eternal agony. They were its batteries, its sources of energy. When Maya stepped into the basement, the creature noticed her. Alex's body twitched, his eyes snapped open, and they were completely black. The huge construction of junk and darkness moved, turning toward her. The Creator has come. The chorus boomed in her head. You are too late. Now you will become our voice. You will draw our world. Dozens of tentacles made of twisted pipes and wires shot out from the walls, rushing toward her. Maya dodged, diving behind a pile of old crates. She needed to get to the boiler room, at the far end of the basement. She ran, leaping over puddles, dodging the attacking appendages. The creature roared with fury, shaking the entire house. Maya could see screaming faces appearing and disappearing in its dark mass. She saw Mark and his girlfriend, their eyes filled with terror before the darkness consumed them again. There it was. The door to the boiler room. Rusty but sturdy. She yanked the handle, and it gave way. She tumbled inside and slammed the door just a second before something heavy crashed into it with a deafening boom. The boiler room was a small, cramped space. In the center stood an ancient boiler, resembling an armored vessel. A thick gas pipe with a large red valve ran from it to the wall. Hurry! Alex screamed in her mind. I can't hold it back for long. It's about to break through. The door shuddered from powerful blows. The metal began to deform. Maya rushed to the valve. It was covered in rust and wouldn't budge. She threw her whole weight against it, but it didn't move an inch. The blows on the door became more frequent, more furious. The first crack appeared in the metal. "Your drawings," Alex whispered. "It distorted them, but it can't destroy your essence. Use it." Maya didn't understand at first. And then it hit her. Imagination. Creativity. That was her power. The creature fed on fear, but creation was alien to it. She closed her eyes, ignoring the crashing behind her. She didn't picture the monsters the creature had shown her. She pictured her real characters, a brave little fox, a wise owl, a funny little bear. She imagined them all turning that damned valve together. She poured all her will, all her love for her craft into that image. She grabbed the valve again. And this time, with a screech that seemed to split her eardrums, it gave way. First a millimeter, then a centimeter. There was a loud hissing sound. Gas began to fill the room. The door couldn't hold. It flew off its hinges, and darkness flooded the opening, forming a monstrous face with a mouth made of broken pipes. Maya jumped back toward the boiler. One last step. A lighter. She didn't have a lighter. The sketchbook flashed through her mind. Alex's sketchbook, the one she had found. It was still in her jacket pocket. And inside was a box of matches soaked, but maybe. She pulled out the matches. Her fingers wouldn't obey, they were trembling. One match broke. A second. The creature was advancing, filling the room with its icy presence. The third match struck and lit. A tiny, flickering flame of hope in the heart of the all-consuming gloom. She threw it. The explosion was deafening. A wave of fire and heat threw her back against the far wall. For a moment, the entire world became blindingly white. And then she woke up on the street, on the rain-slicked asphalt. She didn't remember how she got out. Sirens were wailing all around. The Grandview was engulfed in flames. Fire erupted from every window, consuming the old wood, turning a centuries-old nightmare into ash. She watched the cleansing flames, tears streaming down her cheeks. In the roaring fire, for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw them. Translucent figures, rising up with the smoke. A little boy in a sailor suit, waving to her. An old woman, giving her an encouraging nod. And a young man with infinitely sad eyes. Alex. He looked directly at her, and his gaze was filled with gratitude. He smiled, a real smile for the first time, and then dissolved into the light. The cycle was broken. The price was terrible, but they were free. Maya held up her hand. The inky veins under her skin were gone, leaving only a pale, barely visible scar on her wrist, like the imprint of cold fingers. She touched her forehead. The cold was gone. She turned away from the burning house and walked away, into the dawn, toward a new life built on the ashes of the old one. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing: she would never be afraid of the dark again. Because she had seen that even the smallest flame can burn away the deepest darkness. And sometimes, very rarely, in the silence of the night, when a faucet drips, she thinks she hears a quiet, barely audible melody. But there is no more pain nor longing in it. Only peace.